There is a conversation happening right now that most people are not prepared for. Not a conversation between politicians or scientists or economists, though all of them are speaking. A conversation between the ancient record and the present moment. Between what was written thousands of years ago by men who could not have known what the world of the 21st century would look like, and what is unfolding on screens, in laboratories, in parliaments, and across the surface of the earth right now. I want to walk through that conversation carefully, not sensationally, not with the breathless urgency of someone who has found a code hidden in the numbers, but with the gravity that the text itself demands. Because if the biblical prophets were right, and the evidence is accumulating in ways that deserve serious attention, then what we are living through is not merely historical turbulence, it is fulfillment. The first prophecy begins with creation itself. When the prophet Joel wrote, in the second chapter of his book, that there would come a day when the earth shook, when the heavens trembled, when the sun was turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord, he was writing in the literary conventions of apocalyptic literature. That much is acknowledged by every serious scholar of the ancient text. But there is something else in the prophetic tradition that runs alongside those dramatic images, something quieter and perhaps more precise. The book of Revelation, chapter 8, speaks of a third of the trees burned up, a third of the sea turning, waters becoming bitter, the creation under judgment, the natural order in revolt. What the ancient writers described in symbolic language, the instruments of modern science are now measuring in parts per million. The Earth's surface temperature has risen by more than 1 degree Celsius since the pre-industrial period. That number sounds small. It is not small. A single degree of average warming across the entire planetary system is the equivalent of a fever running through a body that has never been sick before. The consequences are not projections anymore. They are observations. Glaciers that took 10,000 years to form are disappearing within a single human lifetime. Ice sheets that stabilized coastlines for millennia are fracturing and retreating. Rainfall patterns that sustained civilizations for thousands of years are shifting in ways that have no precedent in recorded human history. The question the prophetic texts force us to ask is not whether these events are happening. They are happening. The question is what framework we use to understand them. Scripture does not present the natural world as a passive backdrop to human history. It presents creation as a participant in covenant. When Israel obeyed, the land gave its fruit, the rains came in their season, and the borders held. When Israel rebelled, the text records with specific and sobering precision the withdrawal of blessing from the land itself. Leviticus chapter 26 describes what happens when a covenant people abandon their covenant responsibilities. The heavens become like iron, the earth like bronze. The ground does not give its strength. The land, Scripture says, will be laid waste. I am not suggesting a simple one-to-one correspondence between ancient Israel's covenant violations and the global climate crisis of the 21st century. The theological relationship is far more complex than that, and careful readers of Scripture know better than to flatten the text into a political slogan. But what I am saying is this: the prophetic tradition consistently presents the groaning of creation as connected to the moral and spiritual condition of those who inhabit it. Paul says in Romans chapter 8 that the whole creation groans and labors in birth pangs together until now. That groaning is not metaphorical. It has measurable coordinates. This is where the first prophecy sits, not comfortably, but precisely. The second prophecy moves from the earth to the human mind itself. In Daniel chapter 12, in one of the most discussed passages in the entire canon of apocalyptic scripture, the angel speaking to Daniel says this: "Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." It is a short sentence. It has generated an enormous amount of interpretive literature. The Hebrew phrase translated as run to and fro carries the connotation of frantic, purposeful movement in every direction simultaneously, a world in perpetual restless motion. And knowledge shall increase. For most of Christian history, that phrase was read as a general statement about the expansion of human learning. Scholars noted the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution. each era pressing against the limits of what was known. But nothing in the 4,000 years since Daniel wrote those words compares to what began in the last decade of the 20th century and has now, in the mid-2020s, accelerated past every reasonable prediction made by the most optimistic technologists of that era. Artificial intelligence. I want to be careful here, because the word is used loosely and the subject deserves precision. What has emerged in the space of roughly 4 years is not simply a faster calculator. What has emerged is a system capable of reading the entire published scientific literature of humanity and identifying connections that no individual human being could ever have assembled. A system that in 2026 is not merely answering questions, but joining the process of discovery in physics, in chemistry, in biology. A system that researchers at one California laboratory demonstrated could identify previously unknown evidence about the mechanism by which aging brain cells in Alzheimer's disease signal for their own destruction. Think carefully about what that means. Knowledge that would have taken a team of researchers 20 years to assemble by reading and cross-referencing existing papers, assembled in a fraction of that time by a machine. The exponential curve of human knowledge, which was already steep, has become nearly vertical. And the systems driving it are themselves improving faster than the people building them anticipated. Many shall run to and fro. Look at the world of 2026. Every person on earth who carries a device in their pocket is running, in the sense Daniel's angel described, across the entire accumulated knowledge of civilization simultaneously. A farmer in rural Kenya and a student in Seoul and a grandmother in Ohio are all moving through the same information space at the same moment. The world has never looked like this before. It has never been possible for it to look like this before. Knowledge has increased. That is not a disputed observation. The question Daniel's text presses upon us is what comes next. The third prophecy is perhaps the one most visibly evident in the headlines of any given week. Jesus, in Matthew chapter 24, when the disciples asked him what the sign of his coming and of the close of the age would be, answered with a list. And on that list, wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom. He described these things not as the end itself, but as the beginning of birth pangs, the early indicators that the larger labor had begun. I want to look at this carefully, because it is easy to observe that wars have always existed and conclude that the prophecy means nothing specific. And that observation is correct as far as it goes. Wars have always existed, but the prophetic text is not simply predicting that wars will occur. It is describing a particular quality of the age: multiple simultaneous theaters, overlapping conflicts, a world in which the line between war and peace has become, as analysts now describe it in precisely this language, ever more blurred. In 2026, the conflicts are not isolated events on the margins of a stable world order. The war in Ukraine has ground into its 4th year with attritional logic that experts describe as glacial progress or frozen exhaustion. The Middle East has expanded into a theater of open conflict that is driving commodity prices, firming inflation expectations, and tightening financial conditions across the global economy. India and Pakistan engaged in a deadly skirmish in 2025 that has not resolved. The Eastern Congo and Rwanda remain locked in a regional conflict with humanitarian consequences the international community has largely failed to address. Sudan's civil war continues to generate one of the worst displacement crises in recent African history. And behind all of these visible conflicts, the grey zones, the cyber incursions, the proxy relationships between major powers, the ambient rivalry that analysts are now describing openly as a state of ambient war. The old rules-based international order is not simply weakening. It is, as serious foreign policy scholars are now writing without qualification, drifting away. Kingdom against kingdom. The phrase in Matthew chapter 24 does not require a single apocalyptic world war to constitute fulfillment. It describes a condition of the age, a quality of persistent, multi-directional instability from which no region of the earth is entirely insulated. That condition is not approaching. It is present. The fourth prophecy draws us back into the economic dimension of Scripture's witness. The book of Revelation, chapter 13, contains the most frequently discussed economic prophecy in the entire Christian canon: the mark of the beast. The system described by John in his vision, in which no one could buy or sell without a mark, a number, a name. Theologians have debated for 2,000 years exactly what this system would look like in practice. Some have interpreted it symbolically. Some have interpreted it institutionally. Some have insisted it referred entirely to the first-century Roman context in which John was writing. But the structural logic of the prophecy deserves attention independent of any particular interpretive commitment. What John describes is a centralized economic system in which participation in commerce is conditional on compliance with the demands of a governing authority. A system in which the act of buying and selling is not a private transaction between two parties, but a monitored, permission-based interaction within a framework that someone else controls. I want you to consider where the global economy is moving. The tariff regime of 2026 is not merely a trade dispute. It is a demonstration that economic participation, even at the level of international commerce between sovereign nations, can be controlled, restricted, and made conditional on political compliance. The Supreme Court of the United States in 2026 ruled on the scope of executive authority to impose tariffs. That ruling is itself evidence of how thoroughly the structure of buying and selling has become entangled with centralized political authority in ways that would have been unimaginable 50 years ago. Meanwhile, the development of central bank digital currencies in multiple major economies simultaneously is creating the technical infrastructure for exactly the kind of monitored, conditional economic participation that John's vision describes. No single development fulfills the prophecy in isolation. That is not how fulfillment has historically worked. What we observe is the assembly of components, the architecture being laid, the systems being tested, and Scripture's witness is that the architecture, once complete, will be used in ways that Scripture already described. The fifth prophecy returns to the language of the Spirit. In the second chapter of the book of Acts, Peter stands in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost and quotes the prophet Joel directly. He identifies the outpouring of the Spirit as the fulfillment of Joel's words. But the full text of Joel's prophecy, which Peter quotes in its entirety, contains a detail that the day of Pentecost did not exhaust. Joel says that in the last days, young men shall see visions, and old men shall dream dreams, and God will pour out his Spirit on all flesh. On all flesh. Not on Israel alone. Not on one ethnic group or one geographic region. On all flesh. The global expansion of Christianity is, by every measurable indicator, one of the most significant demographic and spiritual shifts in human history. The center of gravity of the Christian world is not in Europe, where the ancient institutions of Christendom were constructed. It has moved. Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South and Southeast Asia. The growth of the believing community in regions that were untouched by the gospel 2 centuries ago is not a footnote to Christian history. It is, by sheer numbers, the main story of Christianity in the 20th and 21st centuries. Missiologists, the scholars who study the global spread of faith communities, describe the current moment as without precedent in the history of religion. The rate at which communities previously outside the reach of the biblical text are now reading, translating, embodying, and transmitting it has no parallel. And it is happening simultaneously with the technological explosion described in the second prophecy, because the same systems that are accelerating knowledge are also accelerating the movement of the biblical text into languages and communities that have never had access to it before. Joel said, all flesh. The trajectory of history is pointing in exactly that direction. Now, I want to be honest with you, because the text demands honesty, and I believe you do as well. None of what I have described in this video is proof in the mathematical sense of that word. Prophecy has never worked that way. The biblical tradition consistently describes prophetic fulfillment as something that becomes visible in retrospect, something that you recognize as it arrives, rather than something you can predict with the certainty of an engineer designing a system. Jesus himself said that even the Son did not know the day or the hour. The appropriate posture before these things is not certainty. It is watchfulness. It is discernment. It is the kind of serious, unhurried attention to the text and to the present moment that allows you to see the pattern as it forms, without forcing the pattern where it does not exist. But watchfulness requires that you actually look. And what the text asks of those who look is not primarily an intellectual response. It is not the compilation of a list of prophecies and their corresponding current events, satisfying as that exercise can feel. What the text asks is what it has always asked. Fear God, it says. Keep His commandments. Watch and pray. Let your lamp be filled with oil. Be ready. Because the same prophets who describe the wars and the knowledge explosion and the economic systems and the groaning of creation also described what comes after. And what comes after is not described, in any passage I have studied carefully, as a thing to be feared by those who are prepared for it. It is described as the consummation of everything the covenant was pointing toward from the beginning. If you are watching this and these questions matter to you, if you want to go deeper into what Scripture actually says about the days we are living in, the ancient texts that address these moments with a precision that does not require you to flatten them into slogans, then stay with this channel. Every week we open these passages carefully. We trace the theological threads. We sit with the difficulty of the text and do not flinch from what it says. Subscribe now. Turn on the notifications so you do not miss what comes next. Because the conversation between the ancient record and the present moment is not slowing down. It is, by every measure, accelerating. And the wisest thing a person living in this hour can do is learn to read what is written.